Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Miss Marple and the Grandmother's Deadly Secret. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Edward, and I'm so glad you're here. It's always amazing how these quiet little mysteries bring us closer, no matter where in the world we're listening from. If you'd like, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I read every single one. Now take a deep breath, pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Death in the Family Portrait. The village of St. Mary Mead wore its autumn colours like a well-loved shawl, crisp leaves dancing along the high street as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward Whitmore House. The October morning carried with it that particular quality of light that seemed to render everything slightly melancholy, though perhaps that was merely her imagination, coloured as it was by the sombre occasion that brought her out so early. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had passed away 3 days prior, slipping quietly into that final sleep at the remarkable age of 89. Miss Marple had known Eleanor for the better part of 40 years, though their acquaintance had been more cordial than intimate. The Whitmores were one of those old county families whose roots ran deep in the village soil, their name appearing on church records dating back centuries, and their influence woven into the very fabric of local society. The funeral service at St. Mary's had been well attended, as befitted a woman of Eleanor's standing. Now, as Miss Marple approached the imposing Georgian facade of Whitmore House for the wake, she reflected on the curious nature of such gatherings. Death, she had long observed, had a peculiar way of bringing out both the best and worst in people, stripping away the polite veneer that usually governs social interactions. The front door stood open, revealing glimpses of black-clad figures moving through the hallway beyond. Miss Marple paused for a moment on the threshold, her sharp blue eyes taking in the scene with the particular attention she had cultivated over decades of observing human nature. There was something in the air today beyond the expected atmosphere of mourning, something that made her instincts prickle with quiet unease. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come!" Margaret Whitmore appeared at her elbow, Eleanor's daughter-in-law, a woman in her late 50s with the sort of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of regular visits to London. Her smile was perfectly appropriate for the occasion, yet Miss Marple detected something brittle beneath its surface, like ice that might crack under pressure. "My dear Margaret, I wouldn't have missed paying my respects. Eleanor was such a fixture in our little community." Miss Marple allowed herself to be guided into the drawing-room, where the formal portrait of Eleanor Whitmore in her youth dominated the far wall. The painting showed a beautiful young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes, wearing a pearl necklace that Miss Marple recognized from having seen Eleanor wear it to church functions over the years. The room buzzed with the particular sort of conversation that accompanies such gatherings, voices pitched low out of respect for the deceased, yet carrying an undercurrent of something Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. She accepted a cup of tea from the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, whom she had known for nearly as long as she had known Eleanor herself. "Such a peaceful passing," Mrs. Davies murmured, though her eyes seemed troubled. In her sleep, just as she would have wanted. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she found herself studying the various family members clustered around the room. There was David Whitmore, Eleanor's grandson, a man in his 30s who had inherited the family's strong jaw, but seemed to lack their customary confidence. He stood near an ornate hope chest in the corner, his eyes darting toward it with a frequency that Miss Marple found curious. "Grandmother always said she wanted to go peacefully," came a voice from near the portrait. Susan Whitmore, Eleanor's granddaughter, was perhaps 25, with a sort of refined prettiness that came from good breeding and careful attention to appearance. She had been Eleanor's primary caregiver in recent years, Miss Marple recalled, having moved back to Whitmore House after her mother's death to look after the elderly woman. Yes, dear, Margaret agreed, though Miss Marple noticed how quickly she changed the subject. We're all so grateful for how devoted you were to her in her final years. There was something in the way Susan's eyes flickered when she mentioned her grandmother's final wishes that caught Miss Marple's attention. The young woman's hand trembled slightly as she raised her teacup, and Miss Marple made a mental note of the detail. In her experience, people's hands often betrayed what their words tried to conceal. Dr. Haydock appeared at Miss Marple's side, his familiar presence a comfort in the charged atmosphere of the room. They had worked together on more than one occasion when death had visited St. Mary Mead under less natural circumstances, and Miss Marple valued both his medical expertise and his discretion. "Sad business," he murmured, accepting a cup of tea from the hovering housekeeper, "though I suppose we should be grateful she didn't suffer." Miss Marple studied his face carefully. "Quite peaceful, I understand." Dr. Haydock's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he had more to say. "Perhaps we might step into the garden for a moment. The fresh air might do us both good." The garden at Whitmore House was extensive and well maintained, with formal beds that had been Eleanor's pride and joy. They walked in silence for a few moments before Dr. Haydock spoke again, his voice carefully modulated. "Jane, I need to speak with you confidentially. Eleanor's death, while it appeared natural on the surface, has presented some puzzling aspects." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken slightly, though her expression remained placid. "Oh?" The post-mortem examination revealed traces of digitalis in her system. Not enough to have caused her death directly, mind you, but enough to suggest that someone had been administering it over a period of time. Dr. Haydock's voice was troubled. "It's possible she was medicating herself with foxglove preparations, of course. Some of the older generation still believe in such remedies, but the levels suggest a more systematic administration." They paused beside a bed of autumn roses, their blooms heavy with morning dew. Miss Marple's mind was already working, filing away this crucial piece of information alongside her observations of the family's behavior. "Have you shared this with the family?" she asked quietly. "Not yet. I felt it wise to discuss the matter with someone whose judgment I trust before taking any official action. If there's something untoward here, we need to proceed carefully." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting back toward the house where the wake continued. Through the drawing-room windows she could see the family still gathered around Eleanor's portrait, their body language suggesting conversations that were anything but casual condolences. "I think," she said carefully, "that it might be wise to observe the family's behavior a bit longer before drawing any conclusions. Sometimes grief manifests in unexpected ways." Dr. Haydock understood her meaning perfectly. They had worked together long enough for him to recognize when Miss Marple's instincts were engaged. As they made their way back toward the house, Miss Marple found herself studying the flower beds with new interest. Foxglove grew wild in many English gardens, its beautiful purple blooms hiding a deadly secret that had been known since ancient times. Re-entering the drawing-room, Miss Marple immediately noticed that the atmosphere had grown even more tense in their absence. Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, had arrived, and was speaking in low tones with Margaret and her son David. Their faces bore expressions of barely concealed anxiety that seemed quite at odds with the typical concerns of bereaved relatives. "The reading of the will," Susan was saying to a small group of neighbours, "has been postponed. Grandmother left some rather specific instructions that need to be followed first." Miss Marple positioned herself within earshot, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a piece that had been her constant companion for weeks. The rhythmic motion helped her think, and the familiar activity made her effectively invisible to those around her. "What sort of instructions?" asked Mrs. Price from the post office, her curiosity evident. Susan's composure slipped for just a moment. She wanted certain family matters to be clarified before her final wishes were made known. Grandmother was always very particular about doing things properly. The way she emphasized the word properly suggested layers of meaning that Miss Marple found intriguing. She glanced toward the hope chest in the corner, noting that David had moved closer to it, almost as if he were guarding it from eyes. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I must announce that the formal reading of Mrs. Whitmore's will has been delayed at her specific request. She left very clear instructions that certain family documents and records must be reviewed before her testamentary wishes can be properly executed." A murmur ran through the assembled guests, and Miss Marple observed the family's reactions with keen interest. Margaret's face had gone quite pale, while David looked positively green around the gills. Only Susan seemed to maintain her composure, though Miss Marple noticed that her hands had clenched into small fists. "How long might this delay be?" asked someone from the back. "That depends entirely on how quickly we can resolve the matters Mrs. Whitmore wished to address," Mr. Pemberton replied diplomatically. "I ask for your patience during this difficult time." As the gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered, helping Mrs. Davies clear away teacups while keeping her ears open for any revealing conversations. The family members clustered together near the portrait, their voices too low to overhear clearly, but their body language spoke volumes about the stress they were experiencing. Walking home through the village as the afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's observations. Eleanor Whitmore's death might have appeared natural on the surface, but the undercurrent she detected suggested that all was not as peaceful as it seemed. The traces of digitalis in Eleanor's system, combined with the family's obvious anxiety about whatever secrets Eleanor had left behind, painted a picture that was far from the simple passing of a beloved matriarch. Miss Marple had learned long ago that families often harboured secrets that could fester for generations, and that death had a way of bringing such secrets to the surface. Whatever Eleanor Whitmore had planned to reveal from beyond the grave was clearly causing considerable distress among her survivors. The question that remained was whether someone had been desperate enough to prevent those revelations from ever seeing the light of day. As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple made a mental note to pay closer attention to the Whitmore family in the coming days. If her instincts were correct, Eleanor's death might be only the beginning of a much more complex and dangerous story. Chapter 2: The Inheritance Nobody Wanted. 3 days after the wake, Miss Marple found herself once again walking toward Whitmore House, though this time her invitation had come through somewhat unusual channels. Susan Whitmore had appeared at her door that morning, looking considerably more strained than she had at the funeral gathering. "Miss Marple," she had said, her voice carrying an undertone of desperation, "I wonder if you might join us for the reading of Grandmother's will this afternoon. She specifically mentioned that she hoped you would be present." Miss Marple had accepted graciously, though she found the request curious. Eleanor had been cordial but hardly intimate, and it seemed odd that she would have wanted a relative outsider present for such a private family matter. Nevertheless, her instincts told her that this invitation might provide valuable insights into whatever secrets the Whitmore family was harbouring. The drawing room at Whitmore House had been rearranged for the occasion, with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing Mr. Pemberton's desk. The family solicitor looked uncommonly grave as he shuffled through his papers, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands shook slightly as he prepared to begin. Margaret Whitmore sat rigidly upright, her face a mask of controlled anticipation. David had positioned himself near the window, as if preparing for a quick escape, while Susan occupied the chair closest to her grandmother's portrait. The hope chest remained in its corner, but Miss Marple observed that someone had placed a small key on the mantelpiece directly above it. "Before we begin," Mr. Pemberton announced, clearing his throat nervously, "I must inform you that Mrs. Whitmore's will contains certain unconventional provisions. She was very specific about the order in which information was to be revealed." Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and prepared to observe. In her experience, wills often revealed more about family dynamics than any amount of casual conversation. Mr. Pemberton adjusted his spectacles and began to read. "I, Eleanor Mary Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament." His voice grew stronger as he continued. But Miss Marple noticed that the family members were leaning forward with an intensity that suggested they expected something quite different from the usual bequests. The first shock came quickly. Eleanor had left her entire estate, the house, the substantial investments, the family heirlooms, to various charitable organizations. The local church would receive the house to be used as a community centre, while her financial assets were to be distributed among several charities that supported war orphans and displaced persons. Margaret gasped audibly, while David's face went ashen. Susan alone seemed unsurprised, though Miss Marple noticed that her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. "There must be some mistake," Margaret managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mother always said the house would stay in the family." Mr. Pemberton held up a hand for silence. "I'm afraid there's more. Mrs. Whitmore has left personal mementos to each family member, but she was very specific about the conditions under which these bequests would be honoured." He withdrew a sealed envelope from his papers. "She left this codicil with very particular instructions. If any family member contests the will or attempts to challenge its provisions, this envelope is to be opened and its contents made public." The silence that followed was so complete that Miss Marple could hear the ticking of the mantelpiece clock. The family's reaction was immediate and telling, not the shock of learning about disinheritance, but the terror of discovery. "What could she possibly have written that would concern us?" Margaret asked, though her voice lacked conviction. "I have no idea," Mr. Pemberton replied, though Miss Marple suspected he was being less than truthful. "Mrs. Whitmore came to me several weeks before her death, very agitated, and insisted on making these arrangements. She said she had discovered something that required her to set the record straight, as she put it." Susan spoke for the first time since the reading began. Grandmother had been acting strangely in her final weeks. She kept talking about making amends for old sins, whatever that meant. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Eleanor's behaviour in her final weeks was clearly significant, and the family's fear of her posthumous revelations suggested that whatever secrets she had discovered were serious indeed. "She spent hours going through old papers," Susan continued, glancing toward the Hope chest. "She was obsessed with that chest, crying over photographs in documents. I tried to help her organize things, but she became quite secretive about it all." David found his voice at last. "Did she say anything specific about what she planned to reveal?" "Only that she had lived with lies for too long, and that the truth needed to come out before she died." Susan's voice grew smaller. "I thought it was just the ramblings of an elderly woman, but now—" Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat again. "There is one more thing. Mrs. Whitmore left instructions that if anyone attempted to challenge the will, or if there were any suspicious circumstances surrounding her death, I was to contact the authorities immediately." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Eleanor had been more prescient than anyone had realized, planning for the possibility that her death might not be as natural as it appeared. The family exchanged glances loaded with meaning, and Miss Marple realized that they were all thinking the same thing she was, that Eleanor's concerns about her own safety had been well-founded. As the gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered to speak with Mr. Pemberton privately. "It's quite unusual for someone to make such specific provisions about the circumstances of their death," she observed mildly. The solicitor nodded grimly. Mrs. Whitmore was convinced that someone in the family meant her harm. She wouldn't elaborate, but she was adamant that these precautions were necessary. "And the sealed letter?" "Contains information that she said would destroy the family's reputation forever if it were made public. She hoped that the threat alone would be sufficient to ensure that her wishes were respected." Miss Marple walked home through the village centre, her mind working through the implications of what she had learned. Eleanor's will was clearly designed to punish her family for something, but what? The disinheritance was complete and deliberate, but the greater threat lay in whatever revelation she had left behind. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Whitmore family's behaviour suggested that Eleanor's threats had been very real, and that whatever secrets she had uncovered were serious enough to warrant desperate measures. The traces of digitalis in Eleanor's system took on new significance in light of the day's revelations. If someone had been slowly poisoning her, it suggested that they had been trying to ensure her death came before she could reveal whatever damaging information she possessed. Miss Marple made a mental note to pay closer attention to the family's movements in the coming days. With Eleanor's will now read and her threats made clear, the pressure on whoever had been responsible for her death would be mounting. In her experience, such pressure often led people to make mistakes that revealed their guilt. The question that remained was whether Eleanor's precautions would be enough to ensure that justice was served, or whether her killer would find a way to escape the consequences of their actions. Miss Marple had a feeling that the real drama was only just beginning. As she prepared for bed that night, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. Eleanor Whitmore had been a shrewd woman who had recognized danger and prepared for it as best she could. The fact that she had still died under suspicious circumstances suggested that her adversary had been both determined and clever. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would pay a visit to the church where Eleanor's charitable bequests would be administered. Sometimes the recipients of such gifts had insights into the donor's motivations that family members lacked. If Eleanor had been planning to reveal family secrets, she might have confided in someone outside the family circle. The game, as a fictional colleague might have said, was definitely afoot. Chapter 3: Secrets in the Hope Chest. The morning after the will reading, Miss Marple found herself with an unexpected visitor. Susan Whitmore stood at her front door, her usual composure clearly frayed around the edges. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested a sleepless night, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a handbag. "Miss Marple, I hope you don't mind my calling so early," Susan began, her voice strained. "I wondered if you might come back to the house with me. There's something I need to show you. Something about grandmother's things." Miss Marple invited her in for tea, noting how the young woman's eyes darted nervously about the cosy sitting room. "You seem troubled, my dear. Perhaps it would help to talk about what's worrying you." Susan accepted the cup of tea with hands that shook noticeably. "It's the hope chest, Miss Marple. The one you saw in the drawing room yesterday. Grandmother had been going through it obsessively in her final weeks, and now that she's gone, I feel I should organize her papers properly. But when I began looking through everything—" She paused, seeming to struggle with how to continue. Miss Marple waited patiently, having learned long ago that people often revealed more when given time to find their own words. "There are things in there that don't make sense," Susan finally continued. "Documents that seem to contradict what I've always known about our family history. I thought perhaps you might look at them with fresh eyes, help me understand what grandmother was so upset about." Miss Marple agreed readily, her curiosity thoroughly piqued. An hour later, she found herself back in the drawing room at Whitmore House, with Susan using the small key from the mantelpiece to open the ornate hope chest. The chest was beautifully crafted, with intricate carvings on its lid and lined with faded blue silk. As Susan lifted the lid, the scent of lavender and old paper wafted out, carrying with it the weight of decades of carefully preserved memories. "Grandmother organized everything so precisely," Susan murmured, lifting out neat stacks of documents tied with a ribbon. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, photographs going back generations. "But look at this." She handed Miss Marple a birth certificate that bore the official seal of the local registrar. The document was dated 1943 and recorded the birth of a female child to one Mary Whitmore. Miss Marple studied it carefully, noting the careful penmanship and official stamps. "But this can't be right," Susan continued, her voice growing more agitated. "My Aunt Margaret wasn't born until 1945, and her given name was never Mary. Grandmother's name was Eleanor, not Mary. I don't understand who this could be." Miss Marple examined the document more closely. The paper was authentic, showing the appropriate aging and official markings, but the name discrepancy was indeed puzzling. "Are there other documents that might shed light on this?" Susan reached deeper into the chest and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with a faded pink ribbon. "These are love letters, addressed to my dearest Mary. They're signed only with the initial J, but they're clearly from during the war years." Miss Marple accepted the letters, noting their wartime postmarks and the masculine handwriting. The paper was of good quality, and the tone was that of a man deeply in love writing to his beloved. She read several passages aloud. "My darling Mary, I count the days until I can return to you and we can be properly married. The thought of our future together is what keeps me going through these dark times." Another letter, dated several months later, spoke of plans for a wedding and hopes for children. The final letter in the bundle was different in tone, more urgent. "Mary, my love, I fear this may be my last letter to you. We ship out tomorrow for what promises to be a dangerous mission. If something should happen to me, know that you have been the light of my life. Take care of yourself and our child." Susan's face had gone pale as Miss Marple read. "Our child? But what child? And who is this Mary person?" Miss Marple continued her examination of the chest's contents, finding photograph albums that told a story quite different from the official family history. Among the formal portraits in family gatherings were more intimate photographs. A young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor in her youth, but who was clearly not Eleanor, standing with a man in military uniform. Another photograph showed the same woman holding a baby. "This woman in the photographs," Miss Marple observed, "bears a remarkable resemblance to your grandmother in her youth. Could this be the Mary mentioned in the letters?" Susan leaned closer to examine the photographs. "The resemblance is uncanny, but I've never seen these pictures before. And look at this." She pointed to an impression in the silk lining of the chest. "There's clearly been something else kept here, something roughly the size of a marriage certificate, but it's missing now." Miss Marple ran her fingers along the impression in the fabric. The outline was clear and rectangular, suggesting that an important document had been stored there for many years before being recently removed. "When did you last see your grandmother going through this chest?" "Just 2 days before she died. She spent the entire afternoon with it, crying and muttering about the child who never knew the truth. I thought she was becoming confused, talking about the past as if it were present. But now I wonder if she was trying to tell me something important." They continued to examine the chest's contents methodically. There were legal documents dating back to the 1940s, property deeds, and insurance papers, but Miss Marple noticed that several items appeared to be missing based on the careful organization of everything else. The gaps in the chronological filing suggested that someone had selectively removed specific documents. "Susan, dear, you mentioned that your grandmother was secretive about the chest in her final weeks. Did anyone else have access to it?" "Well, the whole family knew about it, of course. It's been in that corner for as long as I can remember, but grandmother always kept it locked, and she was the only one with the key." Susan paused, looking troubled. "Though I suppose any of us could have taken the key when she wasn't looking. She sometimes left it on the mantelpiece when she was working with the papers." Miss Marple made a mental note of this information. If someone had been removing documents from the chest, it suggested they were trying to hide evidence of whatever family secret Eleanor had discovered. As they reached the bottom of the chest, Susan gasped and withdrew a small wooden box that had been hidden beneath everything else. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a baby's christening gown, yellowed with age but beautifully preserved. "I've never seen this before," Susan whispered. "Grandmother never mentioned having kept any baby clothes from when father was born." Miss Marple examined the gown carefully. It was made of fine linen with delicate embroidery, clearly expensive and made with great care. A small tag sewn inside bore the initials MM in elegant script. "The initials don't match any family names I know," Susan continued, her voice growing more bewildered. "And the style suggests this is from the 1940s, not the 1920s when my father was born." As they prepared to close the chest, Miss Marple noticed something else. A pressed flower bookmark tucked between the pages of a prayer book. The flower was foxglove, its purple petals carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper. The significance was not lost on either woman. Miss Marple had learned from Dr. Haydock about the digitalis found in Eleanor's system, and foxglove was the plant from which digitalis was derived. The fact that Eleanor had been pressing foxglove flowers and keeping them in her most precious possessions suggested a connection that could not be coincidental. Miss Marple, Susan said quietly, I'm beginning to think that grandmother's death wasn't as peaceful as we all believed. These documents, the missing papers, the way she was behaving in her final weeks, it all suggests she had discovered something that someone didn't want revealed. Miss Marple nodded gravely. I think, my dear, that your grandmother uncovered a family secret that someone was willing to kill to protect. The question now is whether we can piece together the truth before whoever silenced her decides that we know too much. As they left Whitmore House that afternoon, Miss Marple reflected on what they had discovered. The evidence pointed to the existence of a child born during the war years, a child whose existence had been systematically erased from the family records. Eleanor's agitation in her final week suggested she had been planning to reveal this secret, and her death with traces of digitalis in her system suggested that someone had been desperate to stop her. The game was becoming more dangerous, and Miss Marple knew that time was running short to uncover the truth before the killer struck again. Chapter 4. The Matriarch's Final Words. Miss Marple had always found that servants possessed an uncanny ability to observe family dynamics from a unique vantage point, seeing both the public face and private reality of their employers. With this in mind, she found herself taking tea with Mrs. Davies, the Whitmore family's long-time housekeeper, in the comfortable kitchen of Whitmore House, 2 days after her examination of the hoop chest. Mrs. Davies had been with the family for nearly 30 years, arriving as a young woman shortly after Eleanor's husband had passed away. She possessed the sort of quiet dignity that came from years of faithful service, and Miss Marple had always found her to be both observant and discreet. Such a difficult time for the family, Mrs. Davies murmured, pouring tea from a well-worn china pot. Mrs. Whitmore's death has left quite a void, though I must say her behaviour in recent weeks had us all quite concerned. Miss Marple accepted her cup gratefully. In what way concerned? Well, she'd been having me show visitors to the library rather than the drawing room, which was most unusual, and she insisted on dictating letters to young Miss Patricia from the village, rather than writing them herself as she'd always done. Mrs. Davies lowered her voice conspiratorially. Miss Patricia told me later that Mrs. Whitmore was quite agitated during these sessions, sometimes stopping mid-sentence and asking her to destroy what they'd written and start again. Did you happen to see any of these letters? Oh no, Miss Marple. Mrs. Whitmore was very particular about having them sealed immediately and given directly to Mr. Pemberton. She was quite secretive about the whole business. Mrs. Davies paused to sip her tea. But I did notice that she always seemed upset after these sessions, sometimes crying for hours afterward. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Eleanor's correspondence with her solicitor in her final weeks was clearly significant, especially given the sealed letter that now hung like a sword over the family's collective head. I don't suppose Mrs. Whitmore mentioned what was troubling her. Not directly, but she did say some odd things. One morning I found her in the drawing room before dawn, staring at that old portrait of herself. She turned to me and said, "Mrs. Davies, sometimes the sins of our youth come back to haunt us when we least expect it. I thought she was feeling melancholy about growing old, but now I wonder if there was more to it." Mrs. Davies rose to refill the teapot, and Miss Marple noticed that her hands were slightly unsteady. "There's something else, Miss Marple. Something that's been bothering me since Mrs. Whitmore passed. In her final weeks, she became quite particular about her food and drink, especially her tea." "How so?" "She'd taken to preparing her own evening tea, which was most unusual. She'd always enjoyed having me serve her properly, but suddenly she was insisting on doing it herself. She even brought her own tea service down from her bedroom and kept it locked away in the pantry." Mrs. Davies looked troubled. "When I asked if I'd done something wrong, she just patted my hand and said she needed to be careful about what she consumed." Miss Marple's pulse quickened at this revelation. Eleanor's careful attention to her food and drink in her final weeks suggested she had been aware of the danger she was in, possibly even suspecting that someone was attempting to poison her. Did she give any indication of whom she might be suspicious? Not directly, but I did notice she seemed uncomfortable when certain family members were present. Master David made her particularly nervous, and she'd watch him quite carefully whenever he was in the room, Miss Susan too, though that was more recent. What about Mrs. Margaret? Mrs. Davies hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and honesty. Mrs. Margaret has never been easy to work for, if you'll forgive my saying so. She's always been demanding, and she became quite short-tempered in the weeks before Mrs. Whitmore's death. They had several heated conversations behind closed doors, though I couldn't make out what they were discussing. As if summoned by their conversation, the kitchen door opened and Dr. Haydock appeared, looking somewhat grim. Mrs. Davies immediately rose to pour him tea, clearly accustomed to his informal visits to the house. "Jane, I'm glad to find you here," he said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "I've just received some additional results from the laboratory regarding Eleanor's post-mortem examination." Mrs. Davies discreetly busied herself with washing dishes, though Miss Marple was certain she was listening to every word. "The digitalis levels in Eleanor's system show a pattern consistent with regular small doses administered over a period of several weeks," Dr. Haydock continued quietly. "This wasn't accidental poisoning or self-medication. Someone with knowledge of plant toxicology was systematically administering poison." Miss Marple absorbed this information while watching Mrs. Davies' reaction in the reflection of the kitchen window. The housekeeper's shoulders had tensed noticeably at Dr. Haydock's words. "Doctor," Mrs. Davies said suddenly, turning from the sink, "I feel I should mention something. Mrs. Whitmore had been complaining of headaches and fatigue in recent weeks, symptoms she attributed to her age, but she also mentioned feeling dizzy and having palpitations, particularly in the evenings after her tea." "Those are consistent with digitalis poisoning," Dr. Haydock confirmed grimly. "The killer was likely using doses just below the threshold that would cause immediate symptoms, gradually weakening Eleanor's system until her heart could no longer cope." Miss Marple found herself thinking about the pressed foxglove flowers they had discovered in the hope chest. The symbolism was chilling. Eleanor had unknowingly preserved evidence of the very plant being used to kill her. "Mrs. Davies," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned that Mrs. Whitmore had contacted someone recently. Perhaps a private investigator?"
The housekeeper nodded reluctantly. "Yes, about 3 weeks before she passed. A gentleman came to see her, very discreet, not the sort of person who usually called at the house. They spent several hours in the library, and I heard Mrs. Whitmore mention a name, James Morrison, several times during their conversation." Dr. Haydock and Miss Marple exchanged meaningful glances. This was the first mention of an outsider being involved in whatever Eleanor had been investigating. "Did you overhear anything else about this Mr. Morrison?" "Only that Mrs. Whitmore seemed quite agitated about finding him. She kept saying it was important that he be located before it was too late." Mrs. Davies wrung her hands nervously. The investigator left with some papers from Mrs. Whitmore, and she seemed hopeful that he would be successful in his search. Miss Marple was beginning to see the outline of a much larger picture. Eleanor had been actively investigating something or someone from her past, something connected to the mysterious documents in the hope chest and the child born in 1943. Her contact with a private investigator suggested she had been close to uncovering the truth when her death occurred. "There's one more thing," Dr. Haydock said quietly. "I've discovered that Eleanor had been planning to change her will again, very recently. She had scheduled an appointment with Mr. Pemberton for the day after she died." The implications were staggering. If Eleanor had been planning another revision to her will, possibly to include the mysterious beneficiary she had been trying to locate, it provided a compelling motive for murder. Someone had killed her to prevent her from making changes that would have been even more damaging to the family's interests than her current bequest to charity. As Miss Marple walked home through the village that evening, her mind was working furiously to piece together the fragments of information she had gathered. Eleanor Whitmore had discovered a family secret dating back to the war years, a secret involving a child who had been erased from the family records. Her attempts to locate someone named James Morrison and her plans to revise her will suggested she intended to right an old wrong. But someone in the Whitmore family had been desperate enough to commit murder to prevent these revelations from coming to light. The question that remained was which family member had both the knowledge and the opportunity to slowly poison Eleanor with digitalis while maintaining the facade of a devoted relative. Miss Marple had a feeling that the answers lay in the missing documents from the Hope chest, and in whatever information Eleanor's private investigator had uncovered about James Morrison. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Mr. Pemberton and see what additional light he could shed on Eleanor's final plans. The truth was beginning to emerge from the shadows, but Miss Marple knew that in bringing it to light, she was also placing herself in considerable danger from whoever had been willing to kill to keep it hidden. Chapter 5. Blood Thicker Than Water. Miss Marple's visit to Mr. Pemberton's office the following morning proved more illuminating than she had dared hope. The elderly solicitor, clearly burdened by the weight of secrets he had been carrying, seemed almost relieved to have someone with whom he could speak confidentially. "Miss Marple, I must confess that Mrs. Whitmore's final weeks were most distressing for all concerned," he began, settling behind his mahogany desk with obvious fatigue. "The poor woman was in considerable turmoil about matters that had remained buried for decades. The private investigator Mrs. Davies mentioned. Were you aware of his involvement?" Mr. Pemberton nodded grimly. "Indeed. Mrs. Whitmore engaged Mr. Thompson of Thompson Investigations to locate a gentleman named James Morrison. She believed he might still be alive, though he would be quite elderly by now if he had survived the war." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "And did Mr. Thompson's investigation bear fruit?" "Unfortunately, it revealed a most tragic story. James Morrison was killed in action in 1944, just months after his final letter to Mrs. Whitmore. However, Mr. Thompson did discover something else, records indicating that Mr. Morrison had fathered a child before his death." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture in Miss Marple's mind. A child born in 1943. Precisely. A daughter named Mary Morrison, who was given up for adoption shortly after birth. Mrs. Whitmore had recently learned that this child had grown up and, through her own investigations into her parentage, had discovered the identity of her birth mother. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. And this Mary Morrison had contacted Mrs. Whitmore? She had indeed. About 6 weeks before Mrs. Whitmore's death, she received a letter from Mary Morrison, now Mrs. Mary Fleming, requesting a meeting to discuss their relationship. Mrs. Whitmore was devastated to learn that the child she had been forced to give up had spent decades searching for her biological family. The solicitor reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a folder. "Mrs. Whitmore brought me these documents, asking for advice on how best to proceed. The correspondence between mother and daughter makes for heartbreaking reading." Miss Marple examined the letters carefully. Mary Fleming wrote with dignity and restraint, explaining that she had recently lost her adoptive parents and felt compelled to learn about her origins. She made no demands for money or recognition, expressing only a desire to understand her heritage and perhaps meet the woman who had given her life. Eleanor's responses, drafted but apparently never sent, revealed the depth of her anguish. She wrote of the shame and social pressure that had forced her to give up her child, of the decades of regret that had followed, and of her desperate desire to make amends before her death. Mrs. Whitmore was planning to invite Mary Fleming to visit, Mr. Pemberton continued. She intended to publicly acknowledge her as her daughter and include her substantially in a revised will. The current bequests to charity were merely a stopgap measure until she could make proper provision for Mary. And the family's knowledge of this situation? Mr. Pemberton's expression grew troubled. "Mrs. Whitmore confided in me that she suspected at least one family member knew about Mary's existence and was actively working to prevent any reunion. She discovered that several letters from Mary had been intercepted and hidden from her." Miss Marple thought of the missing marriage certificate and other documents from the Hope chest. Did she identify who might have been interfering with her correspondence? She had her suspicions, but wanted to be certain before making accusations. What she did tell me was that the family's reaction to her wartime indiscretion, as she put it, had been what forced her to give up the child in the first place. Her own mother-in-law had threatened to disown the family entirely if the scandal became public. The picture of family dynamics during the war years was becoming clearer. Eleanor, already widowed young and dependent on her in-laws' support, would have had little choice but to comply with their demands to hide her pregnancy and give up her child. Mr. Pemberton, in your professional opinion, would the family have had strong motivations to prevent Mrs. Whitmore from reuniting with her daughter? The solicitor hesitated before answering. The Whitmore family has always prided itself on its reputation and social standing. The revelation that Eleanor had borne an illegitimate child during the war, even under such tragic circumstances, would have been seen as deeply damaging to their image. Moreover, the inclusion of Mary Fleming in the will would have reduced the inheritances they expected to receive. Miss Marple made careful note of these motivations. Social embarrassment combined with financial loss provided compelling reasons for murder, particularly for family members who felt entitled to Eleanor's estate. Was Mrs. Whitmore specific about when she planned to contact Mary Fleming directly? She had arranged to telephone her the evening she died. Mary Fleming was expecting to hear from her mother for the first time in over 40 years. Mr. Pemberton's voice grew heavy with sadness. Instead, she learned of Eleanor's death from the obituary notice in the Times. The timing was significant. If Eleanor's killer had known about the planned telephone call, it would have provided urgency to their actions. They had to silence Eleanor before she could make contact with her long-lost daughter. "There's something else, Miss Marple," Mr. Pemberton continued reluctantly. Mrs. Whitmore suspected that someone had been systematically destroying evidence of Mary's existence over the years. Birth records that should have been in the family Bible had been altered, and photographs had been removed from family albums. Had she identified who might have been responsible for this systematic erasure? She believed it was someone who had access to the family documents over a long period of time, someone who could make changes gradually without arousing suspicion. The tampering had been going on for years, suggesting a long-term campaign to ensure that Mary's existence remained hidden. Miss Marple walked back through the village centre, her mind working through the implications of what she had learned. Eleanor Whitmore had been murdered not just to prevent her from changing her will, but to prevent her from reuniting with the daughter she had been forced to abandon decades earlier. The killer was someone who had been systematically destroying evidence of Mary Fleming's existence for years, someone with intimate knowledge of the family's history and access to their personal documents. This suggested a family member rather than an outsider, someone who had grown up knowing the family's shameful secret. As she approached her cottage, Miss Marple noticed a figure waiting by her gate. It was Margaret Whitmore, looking considerably more haggard than she had at the funeral. Her usual careful grooming had slipped. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you," Margaret said without preamble. "I know you've been asking questions about Mother's death, and I think it's time you knew the truth about our family." Miss Marple invited her in for tea, though she remained cautious. In her experience, when people volunteered information about family secrets, it was often because they wanted to control the narrative rather than reveal the complete truth. "My mother lived with a terrible burden," Margaret began once they were seated in Miss Marple's sitting room. "During the war, she made a mistake that haunted her for the rest of her life. She bore a child out of wedlock, a daughter she was forced to give up for adoption." Miss Marple listened without revealing that she already knew this information, curious to see how much of the truth Margaret would reveal and how much she would attempt to conceal. "The shame nearly destroyed our family," Margaret continued. "My grandmother insisted that the child be given away, and that all evidence of her existence be eliminated. Mother agreed, believing it was best for everyone involved. And recently this daughter had contacted your mother." Margaret's composure slipped slightly. "Yes, and Mother became obsessed with the idea of reuniting with her. She couldn't understand that some mistakes are better left buried, that bringing this woman into our lives would destroy everything our family has worked to build." Miss Marple observed Margaret carefully, noting the way she spoke of Mary Fleming as this woman, rather than acknowledging her as a sister. The resentment and fear in her voice were unmistakable. "Did you know that your mother was planning to include Mary Fleming in her will?" "Mother had lost all sense of proportion," Margaret replied, her voice growing harder. She was willing to sacrifice the security and reputation of her legitimate family for someone who was, frankly, a stranger to us all. Miss Marple found Margaret's choice of words revealing. The emphasis on legitimate family suggested that she viewed Mary Fleming not just as an inconvenience, but as a fundamental threat to her own identity and position within the family hierarchy. As Margaret prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on what this conversation had revealed. Margaret clearly knew about Mary Fleming's existence and felt threatened by Eleanor's plans to acknowledge her. Whether this knowledge extended to murder remained to be seen. The truth about Eleanor Whitmore's death was slowly emerging, but Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous part of her investigation lay ahead. The killer was aware that their secret was being uncovered, and desperate people were capable of taking desperate measures to protect themselves. Chapter 6: The Family Bible's Hidden Truth. The following afternoon found Miss Marple once again at Whitmore House, this time at Susan's invitation to examine what the young woman described as disturbing discrepancies in the family records. Susan met her at the door, looking even more distressed than she had during their previous encounters. "Miss Marple, I've been going through more of Grandmother's papers, trying to understand what she was so upset about," Susan began, leading her toward the library. "I found the family Bible, and when I compared it to the documents we discovered in the Hope Chest, I realized that someone has been altering the records." The library at Whitmore House was a formal room lined with leather-bound volumes, dominated by a large oak desk where generations of Whitmores had conducted their correspondence. On the desk lay an ornate family Bible, its leather binding worn smooth by decades of handling. Susan opened the Bible to the pages traditionally used for recording family births, marriages, and deaths. Miss Marple could immediately see that several entries had been carefully altered, with new ink covering what appeared to be earlier writing. "Look here," Susan pointed to an entry dated 1943. "Someone has written over this completely, but you can still see traces of the original writing underneath. And here, where my Aunt Margaret's birth is recorded, the date has been changed from 1943 to 1945. Miss Marple examined the pages carefully. The alterations had been done skillfully, but under close scrutiny the evidence of tampering was clear. Someone had systematically erased Mary Morrison's existence from the family records while changing Margaret's birth date to eliminate any questions about Eleanor having 2 children. "There's something else," Susan continued, turning to a different section of the Bible. "I found these pressed between the pages." She carefully extracted several preserved flowers from between the tissue-thin pages. Miss Marple recognised them immediately as foxglove blooms, their purple petals still retaining much of their original colour despite their age. "These have been here for years," Susan observed, "but what's strange is that Grandmother was always so careful about her garden. She knew perfectly well that foxglove was poisonous. Why would she preserve them in the family Bible?" Miss Marple studied the flowers thoughtfully. The placement of poisonous flowers in the family Bible seemed almost symbolic, as if Eleanor had been documenting the poison that was slowly destroying her family from within. "Susan, dear, when did you first become aware that your Aunt Margaret might not have been your grandmother's only child?" Susan's face grew troubled. "I suspected something wasn't right about our family history when I was helping Grandmother with her papers last month. She kept mentioning a daughter she had lost, but when I asked about it, she would become very upset and change the subject." Miss Marple turned to another section of the Bible, where loose photographs had been stored between the pages. Most were formal family portraits, but hidden near the back she discovered a photograph that made her pulse quicken. The image showed a young Eleanor Whitmore holding a baby, standing beside a man in military uniform. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "My darling Mary with her papa, 1943. "I've never seen this photograph before," Susan whispered, examining it closely. "The man looks so young, and Grandmother appears so happy. But who could he be?" Miss Marple compared the photograph to the letters they had found earlier. The handwriting on the back matched that of the love letters signed J, and the man in uniform bore a striking resemblance to the style of the wartime period. "This must be James Morrison," Miss Marple concluded. the father of the child mentioned in the birth certificate we found. As they continued examining the Bible, Miss Marple noticed that the binding had been carefully opened and resealed at some point. Hidden within the binding itself, she discovered another photograph, this one showing Eleanor with an older woman who bore a strong resemblance to Margaret. "That's my great-grandmother," Susan said, recognising the older woman. "But I don't understand why this photograph would be hidden in the binding." Miss Marple studied the image carefully. The older woman's expression was stern and disapproving, while Eleanor looked young and frightened. The body language suggested a confrontation rather than a happy family moment. "I suspect this photograph was taken around the time your grandmother was forced to give up her child," Miss Marple observed. "Your great-grandmother appears to be the one who insisted on maintaining the family's reputation at the cost of separating mother and child." They spent the remainder of the afternoon systematically examining every page of the Bible, uncovering additional evidence of systematic alteration. Marriage records had been modified, birth dates changed, and entire entries erased. The pattern suggested a careful, long-term effort to eliminate all traces of Mary Morrison's existence. Whoever did this had to have access to these records over many years, Susan noted, and they needed to know enough about the family history to make the changes seem natural. Miss Marple nodded grimly. The systematic nature of the alterations suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the family's secrets and the patience to make changes gradually over time. As they prepared to close the Bible, Miss Marple made one final discovery. Pressed between the very last pages was a dried flower that was not foxglove, but rather a white rose, the traditional symbol of remembrance and lost love. Attached to the rose was a small piece of paper with a telephone number written in Eleanor's careful handwriting, along with the notation, "Mary Fleming, my beloved daughter." "This must be how Grandmother planned to contact her," Susan said softly. "She kept Mary's telephone number hidden in the family Bible, in the one place she knew it would be safe." Miss Marple realised that Eleanor had been more clever than anyone had given her credit for. Despite someone's systematic efforts to erase her daughter's existence, she had managed to preserve the most important information in the one place her family would never think to look for evidence of their deception. As they left the library, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries. The family Bible had revealed not just the extent of the cover-up surrounding Mary Morrison's existence, but also Eleanor's desperate attempts to preserve the truth despite years of systematic erasure. The killer had been methodical in their efforts to eliminate evidence, but they had made one crucial mistake. In their focus on destroying obvious records, they had overlooked the symbolic significance of the family Bible as a repository for Eleanor's most precious memories. Walking home through the village as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the churchyard, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the pressed flowers and hidden photographs. Eleanor had created her own secret record of the truth, hidden in plain sight within the family's most sacred text. The question that remained was whether this evidence would be enough to identify her killer, or whether the person responsible for decades of deception would find a way to silence the truth permanently. Miss Marple had a growing sense that time was running short, and that the killer was becoming increasingly desperate as their carefully constructed lies began to unravel. Tomorrow, she decided, she would contact Mary Fleming directly. If Eleanor's daughter was still planning to visit St. Mary Mead, her arrival might force the killer into making the sort of desperate move that would finally reveal their identity. The truth was closer than ever, but Miss Marple knew that bringing it to light might prove more dangerous than she had anticipated. Chapter 7. A Legacy of Lies. Miss Marple's telephone call to Mary Fleming proved to be one of the most heart-wrenching conversations of her long experience with human tragedy. The woman who answered spoke with quiet dignity, despite the obvious strain in her voice, and Miss Marple could hear the decades of longing and disappointment that lay beneath her carefully controlled words. "I had given up hope of ever hearing from my mother," Mary Fleming confessed. "When I learned of her death from the newspaper, I felt as though I had lost her twice, once as a child and again as an adult who had finally found the courage to reach out." Miss Marple explained gently about the investigation into Eleanor's death, and the discovery of her desperate attempts to contact her lost daughter. Your mother never stopped loving you, my dear. The evidence suggests she was actively working to arrange a reunion when she died. The letters I sent, Mary continued, her voice breaking slightly. I never received any replies. I began to think she wanted nothing to do with me, that I was simply an unwelcome reminder of a mistake she preferred to forget. I'm afraid someone was intercepting your correspondence, Miss Marple said carefully. Your mother never received most of your letters, and her responses to you were never sent. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of lost years and stolen opportunities. When Mary spoke again, her voice carried a note of steel that reminded Miss Marple strongly of Eleanor's determination. Miss Marple, I would very much like to come to St. Mary Mead, not for any inheritance or recognition, but simply to visit my mother's grave and perhaps understand what prevented our reunion. They arranged for Mary to arrive the following day, and Miss Marple spent the evening preparing for what she suspected would be a confrontation that might finally expose Eleanor's killer. She had invited Dr. Haydock to be present, ostensibly to provide medical context for Eleanor's death, but actually because she anticipated that events might require official intervention. Mary Fleming arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on a grey October morning that seemed to mirror the sombre nature of her visit. She was a woman in her early 50s, with Eleanor's intelligent eyes, and the sort of quiet composure that spoke of strength forged through adversity. Despite the difficult circumstances, Miss Marple found herself immediately drawn to Mary's gentle dignity. I brought some photographs, Mary said, opening a small satchel. I thought you might like to see what my life has been like, the family that raised me, the children I've had. I always hoped that one day I might be able to share these things with my birth mother. The photographs told the story of a well-lived life, a happy marriage, children who had grown into accomplished adults, a career as a teacher that had clearly brought satisfaction. Mary had not simply survived her difficult beginning, she had thrived despite it. Your mother would have been so proud, Miss Marple said sincerely, studying the images of graduation ceremonies and family celebrations. These photographs show exactly the sort of life she would have wanted for you. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Susan Whitmore, who had clearly been watching for Mary's arrival from across the village green. Susan's face was pale, and her usual composure had been replaced by barely controlled agitation. "You must be Mary," Susan said without preamble, her voice carrying an odd mixture of curiosity and hostility. "I'm Susan, Eleanor's granddaughter. I suppose that makes us cousins of some sort." Miss Marple observed the interaction carefully, noting how Susan's eyes kept darting between Mary's face and the photographs spread across the coffee table. There was something in Susan's expression that spoke of recognition, as if she had seen Mary's features before. "I've brought the family Bible," Susan continued, producing the leather-bound volume they had examined the previous day. "I thought you might like to see the corrections that need to be made to our family records." As Susan opened the Bible to the altered pages, Miss Marple watched Mary's reaction closely. The older woman's face remained composed, but tears began to flow silently as she saw the evidence of her systematic erasure from the family history. "Someone went to considerable trouble to remove any trace of my existence," Mary observed quietly. "I wonder why it was so important to pretend I had never been born." Susan's response was immediate and revealing. "You have to understand our family has a reputation in this community. Grandmother's situation during the war would have been seen as scandalous. People in those days didn't understand the circumstances that might lead a respectable woman to—" "To what?" Mary asked, her voice remaining level despite the obvious pain in her eyes. "To fall in love with a man who died serving his country, to bear his child when marriage was no longer possible." Miss Marple noticed that Susan seemed unable to meet Mary's direct gaze, suggesting shame or guilt that went beyond mere family embarrassment. There was something more personal in Susan's reaction, something that spoke of individual responsibility rather than collective family shame. Dr. Haydock arrived as they were examining the Bible together, and Miss Marple was struck by the immediate change in Susan's demeanour. The young woman became visibly nervous, her hands trembling as she attempted to pour tea for their growing group. "Dr. Haydock has been investigating the circumstances of your mother's death," Miss Marple explained to Mary. "I'm afraid there are some troubling aspects
that suggest her passing was not as natural as it initially appeared. Mary listened in shocked silence as Dr. Haydock explained about the digitalis poisoning and the evidence suggesting systematic administration over several weeks. Her face grew progressively paler as the full implications became clear. "Someone killed her to prevent our reunion," Mary said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "After all these years of separation, someone murdered her rather than allow us to meet." Susan's teacup clattered against its saucer as her hands began to shake uncontrollably. "That's a terrible accusation to make," she protested. "Grandmother died peacefully in her sleep. Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows what they were told," Dr. Haydock corrected gently. "But the medical evidence tells a different story." Miss Marple had been watching Susan's reactions throughout the conversation, and she was now certain that the young woman knew far more about Eleanor's death than she had previously admitted. The combination of guilt, fear, and defensive anger in Susan's responses painted a clear picture of someone whose secrets were being exposed. "Susan, dear," Miss Marple said carefully, "perhaps it would be helpful if you told us about your grandmother's final weeks. You spent more time with her than anyone else." Susan's composure finally cracked completely. She was obsessed with the past, constantly going through old papers and photographs. She kept talking about making amends and setting things right. "I tried to explain that some things are better left buried, that bringing up old scandals would only hurt everyone involved." "Including yourself?" Miss Marple asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Miss Marple could see that Susan was struggling with whether to continue her denials or finally reveal the truth. The arrival of Mary Fleming had clearly disrupted whatever plans Susan had made for keeping the family secrets buried along with Eleanor. As the afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple realized that they were approaching the moment when all pretenses would be stripped away, and the truth about Eleanor's death would finally emerge. The confrontation she had been anticipating was drawing near, and she could only hope that when it came, justice would finally be served for a woman who had died trying to reunite with the daughter she had never stopped loving. Chapter 8: The Granddaughter's Confession. The tension in Miss Marple's sitting room had become almost unbearable when Susan Whitmore suddenly stood up, her face deathly pale and her hands trembling violently. The careful facade she had maintained throughout the investigation finally crumbled, revealing the desperate young woman beneath. "I can't bear this any longer," Susan whispered, her voice breaking. "The guilt is eating me alive, and seeing Mary here, knowing what I've done." She collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Dr. Haydock, who moved closer to Susan's chair with the quiet authority of someone prepared to handle a medical emergency. Mary Fleming sat in stunned silence, her eyes fixed on the young woman who just revealed herself as something far more sinister than a protective granddaughter. "Susan," Miss Marple said gently, "I think it would be best if you told us exactly what happened to your grandmother." The words came out in a torrent as if a dam had finally burst. "I was trying to protect our family, don't you understand? Grandmother had lost all sense of proportion. She was willing to destroy everything we had built, everything we represented in this community, for someone who was essentially a stranger." Susan's eyes darted frantically between Miss Marple and Mary, seeking some sign of understanding that was not forthcoming. "You have to realize what it would have meant if the truth came out. The scandal would have ruined us all. My engagement to Charles Morrison would have been broken off. His family would never have tolerated the connection to such impropriety." Miss Marple noted the irony that Susan was engaged to someone who shared a surname with Mary's father, though she suspected this was merely coincidence. "So you decided to prevent your grandmother from revealing the truth by any means necessary." "I didn't plan it," Susan protested, though her words carried little conviction. "At first, I just tried to reason with her. I explained how much damage this revelation would cause, how it would affect not just our family, but the entire community's perception of us. But she wouldn't listen. Dr. Haydock leaned forward, his medical training evident in his careful questioning. When did you begin administering the digitalis, Susan? About 6 weeks ago, when I realized she was serious about contacting Mary. I started with very small amounts, hoping it would just make her feel unwell enough to postpone her plans. I never intended for it to kill her. Susan's voice grew more desperate. I was trying to buy time, to find another way to make her see reason. Mary Fleming spoke for the first time since Susan's confession began, her voice heavy with grief and disbelief. You murdered your own grandmother to prevent her from acknowledging me as her daughter. You don't understand. Susan turned to face Mary directly, her eyes blazing with a mixture of guilt and defiance. You've had your own life, your own family. You didn't need her recognition. But for those of us who had built our entire existence around the Whitmore name and reputation, your appearance threatened everything. Miss Marple observed Susan's justifications with the clinical interest of someone who had encountered such twisted logic before. The young woman had convinced herself that murder was preferable to social embarrassment, that eliminating an elderly woman was justified to protect her own prospects for marriage and social standing. How did you obtain the digitalis? Dr. Haydock asked, his professional curiosity overriding his obvious disgust at Susan's actions. From the foxglove in grandmother's own garden, Susan replied with bitter irony. She had taught me about the medicinal properties of plants when I was a child, never realizing she was providing me with the knowledge I would eventually use against her. The confession continued with increasing details that painted a picture of calculated cruelty. Susan had been intercepting Mary's letters for months, forging responses that discouraged further contact. She had systematically removed documents from the hope chest and altered family records to eliminate any trace of Mary's existence. I convinced myself I was being noble, Susan continued, her voice becoming smaller with each revelation. I thought I was protecting grandmother from making a mistake that would destroy her legacy. But as the weeks went on, and she became more determined to contact Mary, I realized that nothing short of her death would stop her. Miss Marple found herself thinking of Eleanor's final weeks, the elderly woman's growing paranoia about her food and drink, her insistence on preparing her own tea. Your grandmother suspected what you were doing, didn't she? Susan nodded miserably. She became increasingly careful about what she ate and drank. She even started locking away her personal tea service. But I found ways around her precautions. I'd been caring for her for years. I knew all her habits, all her routines. The systematic nature of the poisoning became clear as Susan described how she'd been adding digitalis to Eleanor's food gradually, timing the doses to avoid immediate symptoms while slowly weakening her heart. The knowledge that Eleanor had died, knowing she was being murdered by her own granddaughter, added another layer of tragedy to an already horrific crime. The night she died, Susan continued, tears now flowing freely, she looked at me and said, I know what you've been doing, Susan, but I forgive you, because I understand that you think you're protecting the family. Then she closed her eyes and that was the end. Mary Fleming had been listening to this recitation with growing horror, and Miss Marple could see that she was struggling to comprehend the depth of hatred that had motivated Susan's actions. You let her die believing that her own granddaughter had betrayed her. I thought I could live with it, Susan whispered. I convinced myself that her death was peaceful, that she had simply passed away from natural causes. But then you started asking questions, Miss Marple, and I realized that the truth would come out eventually. And Dr. Haydock had been taking careful notes throughout Susan's confession, and Miss Marple knew that this evidence would be crucial for the official investigation that would inevitably follow. The young woman had provided them with a complete account of premeditated murder, motivated by nothing more substantial than social vanity and family pride. There's something else, Susan said, her voice barely audible. I destroyed the letters that grandmother had written to Mary but never sent. There were dozens of them, spanning decades, all expressing her love and regret for giving up her daughter. I burned them all because I couldn't bear the thought of anyone reading about her pain. This final revelation seemed to break Mary's composure completely. She began to sob quietly, mourning not just for the mother she had lost, but for all the expressions of love that had been destroyed by one person's selfish ambition. Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the situation. Susan's desperate attempts to preserve the family's reputation had ultimately destroyed it far more completely than any wartime scandal ever could have. In trying to prevent social embarrassment, she had brought genuine disgrace upon the Whitmore name. As Dr. Haydock prepared to contact Inspector Slack, Miss Marple found herself thinking about Eleanor's final weeks and the courage it must have taken for her to persist in her plans, despite knowing that someone close to her meant her harm. The elderly woman had died trying to right an old wrong, and her killer had been the very person she had trusted most. The confession was complete, but Miss Marple knew that the aftermath would be long and painful for everyone involved. Justice would be served, but it could never restore the years of separation between mother and daughter, or erase the knowledge that Eleanor had died at the hands of someone she loved. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past Revealed. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage within the hour, his usually brusque manner subdued by the gravity of the situation he had been called to address. Susan Whitmore sat in stunned silence, her confession having drained her of all remaining energy, while Mary Fleming remained by the window, staring out at the village where her mother had lived and died without ever knowing her. Miss Whitmore, Inspector Slack began formally, Dr. Haydock has informed me that you wish to make a statement regarding the death of Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence against you. Susan nodded numbly, seeming to age years in the space of minutes. I understand, Inspector. I want to tell you everything. I can't live with this secret any longer. As Susan repeated her confession for the official record, Miss Marple found herself observing Mary Fleming's reactions. The older woman's face reflected a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the mother she had lost, horror at the circumstances of her death, and perhaps most tragically, a sense of guilt that her very existence had somehow caused this terrible chain of events. Mrs. Fleming, Miss Marple said gently during a pause in the proceedings, I hope you understand that none of this was your fault. Your desire to know your mother was entirely natural and proper. But if I had never contacted her, Mary replied, her voice hollow, she would still be alive. My selfishness in wanting to know about my origins cost her her life. Dr. Haydock looked up from his notes. Mrs. Fleming, with respect, Susan's actions were motivated by her own selfish concerns, not by any wrongdoing on your part. The responsibility for this tragedy lies entirely with the person who chose murder over honesty. Inspector Slack completed his initial interview with Susan and made arrangements for her to be taken into custody. As the young woman was led away, she turned back to Mary Fleming with tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so terribly sorry for what I've done to you and to grandmother. I thought I was protecting our family, but I realize now that I've destroyed it completely. Mary's response was spoken with quiet dignity. I forgive you, Susan, though I cannot understand you. My mother apparently spent her final weeks knowing that someone she loved was trying to kill her, yet she persisted in her attempts to contact me. That kind of love deserves better than what you gave it. After the official party had departed, Miss Marple found herself alone with Mary Fleming and Dr. Haydock. The cottage seemed unnaturally quiet after the intensity of the morning's revelations, and Miss Marple could see that Mary was struggling to process everything she had learned. There's something I must tell you, Mary said finally. When I first wrote to my mother, it wasn't because I needed anything from her. I have had a good life, a loving family, and I've never lacked for anything material. I contacted her because I wanted her to know that her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a letter, carefully preserved in tissue paper. This is the letter I was planning to give her when we met. I wanted her to know about my life, my children, my career as a teacher. I wanted her to understand that giving me up for adoption, as painful as it must have been, had led to a life filled with love and purpose. Miss Marple read the letter with growing admiration for Mary's character. Rather than seeking acknowledgement or material gain, she had wanted to provide comfort to a woman who had carried the burden of their separation for decades. Your mother would have treasured this letter, Miss Marple said softly. Dr. Haydock mentioned that she had been planning to change her will again to include you substantially. I believe she saw you not as a threat to her existing family, but as a gift she had been denied the opportunity to give properly. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. There's something else you should know, Mrs. Fleming. Mr. Pemberton has informed me that Eleanor left specific instructions regarding your inheritance should anything happen to her before you could meet. Despite Susan's actions, your mother's final wishes will be honoured. I don't want her money, Mary said immediately. I never contacted her for financial gain. Perhaps not, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, but accepting her bequest would be a way of honouring her memory and acknowledging the relationship she was never allowed to have with you during her lifetime. They spent the remainder of the afternoon discussing Eleanor's life and the circumstances that had led to Mary's adoption. Dr. Haydock shared memories of Eleanor as a young widow, struggling to maintain her position in society while dealing with an unexpected pregnancy, while Miss Marple described the woman she had known in later years, dignified, intelligent, and carrying an air of sadness that now made perfect sense. The tragedy, Miss Marple observed, is that Eleanor spent 40 years believing she had done the right thing by giving you up, only to discover in her final weeks that she could have acknowledged you openly without the dire consequences her family had predicted. Mary nodded sadly. Society's attitudes changed, but my mother was trapped by the fears and prejudices of an earlier generation. By the time she realized she could safely contact me, it was too late. As evening approached, Dr. Haydock offered to escort Mary to the local inn where she would be staying overnight before returning to her home the following day. Before leaving, she asked Miss Marple if she might visit Eleanor's grave. Of course, my dear. I think your mother would very much like that. The three of them walked through the quiet village to St. Mary's churchyard, where Eleanor's grave was marked by a simple headstone bearing her name and dates. Mary knelt beside the grave and placed a small bouquet of white roses, the same flowers Eleanor had pressed in the family Bible as a symbol of remembrance. I'm here, Mother, Mary whispered. I'm finally here, and I want you to know that I've lived a good life. I want you to know that I understand why you made the choices you did, and that I love you for trying to find me at the end. Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock stood quietly in the background, allowing Mary this private moment with the mother she had never known but had never stopped loving. The tragedy of their separation was complete, but there was also a sense of resolution. Eleanor's truth had finally been revealed, and her killer would face justice. As they prepared to leave the churchyard, Mary turned to Miss Marple with a question that had obviously been troubling her. Do you think my mother knew, in her final moments, that Susan would eventually be caught? Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Your mother was a very intelligent woman, and she had been making careful preparations for the possibility that she might not survive to reveal her secrets. I believe she trusted that the truth would eventually emerge, perhaps through the very evidence she had been so carefully preserving.
Walking back through the village in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of secrets, lies, and ultimately love that had led to this tragic conclusion. Eleanor Whitmore had died trying to right an old wrong, and though her death had been unjust, her determination to acknowledge her lost daughter had not been in vain. The truth had emerged, justice would be served, and Mary Fleming would finally receive the recognition and inheritance that Eleanor had desperately wanted to give her. It was not the reunion either woman had hoped for, but it was a form of closure that honoured both their love and their sacrifice. Chapter 10. Justice Across Generations. 3 months later, Miss Marple sat in her garden on a crisp winter morning, reading a letter that had arrived with the morning post. The envelope bore the careful handwriting she had come to recognise as Mary Fleming's, and its contents brought news of developments that had unfolded since that tragic autumn day when Eleanor Whitmore's secrets had finally been revealed. Susan Whitmore had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for the murder of her grandmother, though her barrister had argued successfully for a reduced sentence based on her previously unblemished character and the psychological pressure she claimed to have been under. Miss Marple found herself unmoved by such justifications, having long observed that true character was revealed not in comfortable circumstances, but in moments of moral testing. Mary Fleming's letter contained updates on the resolution of Eleanor's estate and the changes that had swept through the Whitmore family in the wake of Susan's conviction. Margaret Whitmore had suffered what Dr. Haydock diagnosed as a complete nervous collapse upon learning the truth about her half-sister's existence and her daughter's crime. She was currently residing with distant relatives in Scotland, apparently unable to face the shame that had descended upon the family name. David Whitmore had proven surprisingly resilient in the face of scandal, using the crisis as an opportunity to distance himself from the family's toxic legacy. He had accepted a position with a shipping company in Australia and was planning to start fresh on the other side of the world, leaving behind the suffocating expectations that had contributed to his cousin's desperate actions. "The most remarkable development," Mary wrote, "is that I have decided to accept Mother's bequest of Whitmore House and establish it as a home for displaced persons and war orphans, as she had originally intended. It seems fitting that a house built on the suppression of one war orphan's identity should become a sanctuary for others who have been separated from their families." Miss Marple smiled at this news, recognising the poetic justice inherent in Mary's decision. Eleanor's vision of helping those affected by war would be realised, but through the efforts of the daughter she had been forced to abandon rather than the charitable organisation she had named in her will. The letter continued with news that warmed Miss Marple's heart even more. "I have also commissioned a proper memorial stone for James Morrison, my father, whose grave in France had remained unmarked for all these years. Mother's letters, which were found among her papers after Susan's arrest, contained enough information about his service to locate his burial site. It seems important that he finally received the recognition he deserved as both a soldier and a father." Miss Marple set the letter aside and reflected on the complex chain of events that had led to this resolution. Eleanor's murder had been a tragedy born of social prejudice and family pride, but its aftermath had ultimately led to the very acknowledgement and reconciliation that Susan had killed to prevent. Dr. Haydock appeared at her garden gate carrying his usual medical bag and wearing the expression of someone who brought news to share. "Good morning, Jane. I thought you might be interested to know that I've just returned from visiting Susan Whitmore at the prison." Miss Marple invited him in for tea, curious about his assessment of the young woman's current state of mind. In the months since her arrest, she had occasionally wondered whether Susan had come to understand the full enormity of what she had done. "She's quite changed," Dr. Haydock reported, settling into his familiar chair by Miss Marple's fireplace. "Prison has stripped away the artificial social veneer that seemed to drive so many of her actions. For the first time, I think she's beginning to understand that she murdered someone who loved her unconditionally. Has she expressed genuine remorse?" "More than that. She's asked me to convey a message to Mary Fleming, though I'm not certain it's appropriate to pass it along." Dr. Haydock hesitated, clearly troubled by whatever Susan had told him. Miss Marple waited patiently, having learned that people often needed time to find the right words for difficult truths. Susan wanted Mary to know that she found additional letters among Eleanor's papers, letters that Eleanor had written to Mary over the years but had never sent. Susan had hidden them rather than destroying them, though she's not certain why she preserved them when she destroyed so much other evidence. This news filled Miss Marple with both sadness and hope. Letters expressing Eleanor's love for her lost daughter, dozens of them spanning more than 4 decades, birthday wishes, congratulations for imagined milestones, expressions of regret and love that Eleanor poured onto paper but never dared to send. Susan said that reading them finally made her understand the depth of what she had destroyed. Miss Marple felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined Eleanor's decades of silent correspondence with a daughter she believed would never want to hear from her. "I think Mary would very much want to receive those letters." "I thought so too." Susan has also provided information about the location of additional family documents that she had hidden or destroyed, including the original marriage certificate between Eleanor and James Morrison. Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Marriage certificate?" It appears that Eleanor and James were secretly married shortly before he shipped out for his final mission. Susan discovered this years ago and destroyed the certificate because it legitimised Mary's birth and would have made her claim to the family name unassailable. Dr. Haydock's voice carried disgust at this revelation. Eleanor was never the unwed mother that family legend claimed her to be. This final piece of the puzzle completed a picture that was both heartbreaking and ultimately redemptive. Eleanor had not only been denied the right to raise her child, but had also been robbed of the social recognition that her brief but legitimate marriage should have provided. "Mary Fleming is not illegitimate," Miss Marple said quietly. "She is Eleanor's lawful daughter and has every right to the Whitmore name." Indeed, Susan's revelation has prompted a complete review of Eleanor's legal status during the war years. It appears that the family's shame was based entirely on a lie, perpetuated by Eleanor's mother-in-law, who destroyed the marriage certificate to maintain her version of events. As Dr. Haydock prepared to leave, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the complex web of lies that had shaped 3 generations of the Whitmore family. Eleanor's mother-in-law had begun the deception by denying the legitimacy of her marriage to James Morrison. Margaret had perpetuated it by altering family records. Susan had completed it by committing murder to prevent the truth from emerging. Dr. Haydock, do you believe that people can be redeemed after committing such terrible acts? He considered the question carefully. "I think Susan may spend the rest of her life trying to atone for what she's done. Whether that constitutes redemption is perhaps a question for theologians rather than physicians." That evening Miss Marple sat by her window watching the lights come on throughout St. Mary Mead, reflecting on the strange ways in which justice sometimes manifested itself across generations. Eleanor Whitmore had died believing herself to be a fallen woman who had abandoned her illegitimate child, when in reality she had been a war widow whose baby had been stolen from her by family prejudice and social convention. Mary Fleming would now learn not only that her mother had loved her, but that she had been born into a legitimate marriage blessed by both love and law. The Whitmore name, which Susan had killed to protect, would continue through Mary's children, who bore the bloodline that Susan had tried so desperately to deny. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of the needles as she worked. The case was closed, justice had been served, and truth had finally triumphed over decades of lies. It was not the ending anyone might have wished for, but it was an ending that honoured both love and justice in equal measure. As she prepared for bed that night, Miss Marple reflected that this case had reminded her once again that family secrets, no matter how carefully buried, had a way of emerging eventually. The truth might be delayed, it might be obscured by lies and violence, but ultimately it possessed a power that no amount of deception could permanently suppress. Eleanor Whitmore's love for her lost daughter had transcended death itself, ensuring that justice was finally served and that the lies which had shaped her family for generations were finally exposed to the light.